Preparations for the historic summit of Trump and Kim are proceeding. Let's now go live to our correspondents Miro Lu in Singapore and Jack Barton in Seoul. Miro, let me start with you. It appears a lot of diplomacy is going on in Singapore. What more can you tell us about that?
Yes, Zhongshi. Diplomatic activity gathered pace ahead of a possible June 12th summit in Singapore between DPRK leader Kim Jong-un and US President Donald Trump. Pre-advanced teams from both the US and DPRK are in Singapore. Leading the DPRK delegation here is Mr. Kim Cham-song, Kim Jong-un's de facto chief of staff, who South Korean media refer to as the butler. He was spotted getting into a car at the Singapore's Fullerton Hotel on Tuesday. The American team is led by Mr. Joe Hagan, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations at the White House, and Deputy National Security Advisor Miro Lu. U.S. officials were also seen at a hotel on Sentosa, Singapore Island Resort on Tuesday. So bear in mind that we don't have official announcements from the Singapore authorities or either side about the meeting taking place, what they're talking about. I also tried to contact the U.S. Embassy and they declined to comment. But we know as a fact that both U.S. and DPRK have a team of officials here seemingly laying the groundwork, set the stage for the possible June 12th summit. Zhongshi.
Miro, at this point, do we know about any information on the possible venue and maybe even the schedule of the summit?
In terms of the venue, the latest news is that South Korean newspaper Jonan Able quoted unidentified diplomatic sources as saying that the Istana could play host to the upcoming meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. The Istana, of course, is the official residence and the office of the Singapore president and is also the working office of Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. While the exact location of the summit has not yet been known, other locations thrown up as possible venues including the Shangri-La Hotel and Marina Bay Sands. The former is going to host the Shangri-La Dialogue later this week, an annual security summit here where regional defense ministers gather. This year, the main topic is, of course, the possible upcoming U.S. DPRK meeting and how that is going to change the regional security landscape. Zhongshi.
Our Miro Lu in Singapore for us. Miro, thank you. Let me turn now to Jack in Seoul. Jack, one positive thing that seems to come out of the twists and turns is that, at least for now, the channel of communication seems to be up and running between Pyongyang, Seoul, and Washington. And South Korea and the DPRK will hold a high-level inter-Korean talk on June 1st. Tell us more about that meeting and how are the preparations going?
Well, the preparations are underway and have been essentially sealed since last month because this is the meeting that was abandoned or cancelled by the DPRK on May 15. And the reason that it was cancelled, according to Pyongyang, was over the war games that were ongoing at the time between South Korea and the United States, something that Kim Jong-un had previously told officials here would not affect talks, but there seemed to be a turnaround. So clearly there's going to be a discussion about the status of those war games at the meeting coming up at the DMZ, but also the issue of defectors, because that appears to be another sticking point. That was another of the reasons that the DPRK gave for calling off those talks, particularly the 12 workers at a restaurant in China last year who defected, and according to local media reports here, 2 of them may have been tricked into defecting by the restaurant manager, and so the DPRK wants all 12 back. Of course, South Korea refusing to hand them back over. So these are the kind of sticking points, and we're going to have to wait and see until this meeting is over to find out if, you know, we could see these derail relations between Pyongyang and Seoul again. But the hope is that they won't, because there's a lot of big things to talk about, from family reunions to finally doing a peace, or finally signing a peace treaty that could end the war on the peninsula, the technical state of war that still exists.
And Jack, Yonhap News Agency quoted a South Korean government official as saying that President Moon Jae-in could make a trip to Singapore for a 3-way summit with his U.S. and DPRK counterparts next month, adding complexity to a very fragile situation that's basically hanging by a thread there if that happens. So how likely is that to happen?
Well, if it all goes ahead as planned and Donald Trump heads to Singapore and Kim Jong-un heads to Singapore, it is indeed very likely. From what we're hearing from many officials here, it's sort of been openly talked about by the government, and Moon himself heading down to Singapore for a trilateral summit after the Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump summit, and only if all goes well and a basic deal of denuclearization can be signed, at least the beginning of a roadmap, as we heard from the reporter in that report earlier. I mean, this could be a long process going for 10 to 15 years. This won't be an end result in itself, this meeting, but as long as that initial step is made, what Moon is very keen to do then is sit down with Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un, and immediately start talking about that peace agreement. So they won't necessarily be, he won't be feeding into the nuclear talks. They'll be talking about the first step that will really build more trust, will give the DPRK a greater sense of security. A peace treaty that could finally replace the armistice that brought the hostilities to an end is something that Moon Jae-in very much wants, Kim Jong-un very much wants, and Donald Trump as well. But the thing is, in the United States, officials are saying this should come towards the end of the process, not at the beginning, not because it's a reward, because it would officially recognize the DPRK as a nuclear state in doing so. But nonetheless, Moon and Kim very keen to move on with this as fast as possible.
Our Jack Barton in Seoul and Miro Lu in Singapore. Thanks so much to you both.